tanks. 90 seconds. A missile that was never supposed to fly this deep inland. This is the story of how Ukrainian engineers broke every rule written into their own weapon system. And in doing so, broke the logistic spine of Russia's Black Sea Fleet auxiliary network. The Neptune anti-ship cruise missile was built for one purpose: hunting warships. 6 meters above the wave crests at transonic speed, invisible to radar until it was too late. It was designed to kill steel vessels, displacing thousands of tons, radar-guided, sea-skimming, terminal phase maneuvering. The engineers at the Luch Design Bureau in Kyiv wrote its mission profile in the language of naval warfare: ship acquisition, sea surface tracking, wave height compensation algorithms. Nobody wrote the words land attack. Nobody planned for the valley approach. Nobody imagined retasking it against a fuel farm 80 kilometers inland from the nearest coastline, until somebody did. And what happened in the next 90 seconds rewrote the Neptune's operational biography entirely. I'm your host at UkraineRadar, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today we're going deep inside one of the most technically audacious missile retasking operations of the entire Black Sea campaign. A precision strike on the Tuapse Naval Fuel Depot that ruptured 6 storage tanks in a single volley, starved Russia's fleet auxiliary vessels of marine fuel for weeks, and proved that Ukrainian weapons engineers are not just users of technology. They are its reinventors. To understand why Tuapse mattered, you have to understand what feeds a naval fleet. Not the warships themselves, the support infrastructure, the fuel barges, the logistics vessels, the auxiliary tankers that shuttle marine diesel from shore depots to ships at anchor, keeping engines warm and generators running. Russia's Black Sea Fleet, battered and diminished by Ukrainian maritime strikes, had pulled its major combatants back from Crimea to ports deeper inside Russian territory. Away from Ukrainian drone boats, away from Neptune coastal batteries, away from Storm Shadow strikes. Novorossiysk, Temryuk, and Tuapse. Tuapse sits on the northeastern Black Sea coast, tucked into a geographic notch where the Caucasus Mountains drop sharply to the shoreline. It hosts one of Russia's largest fuel storage complexes on the Black Sea littoral, a farm of cylindrical steel tanks, each holding tens of thousands of cubic meters of refined petroleum products, military-grade marine diesel, aviation fuel, logistics fuel for the fleet auxiliaries that Russia depended on to keep its remaining Black Sea vessels operational. The depot was considered safe, beyond reach. Coastal Neptune batteries couldn't arc a missile inland against a terrain-masked target. Storm Shadow missiles, supplied by the United Kingdom and France, were politically constrained for strikes against Russian territory proper. ATACMS had range, but different mission priorities, and Standard Neptune, the baseline R360 variant, had a range envelope designed around open water engagement geometries, not complex inland terrain penetration. Russia's planners had done the math. Tuapse was outside the envelope. The fuel would keep flowing. The auxiliaries would keep sailing. They miscalculated. Badly. Ukrainian military intelligence, the HUR, had been watching Tuapse for months. Satellite imagery analysis confirmed the depot's tank farm was operating at high throughput. Fuel receipts were tracked through OSINT monitoring of commercial vessel movements in the area. The pattern was clear. Tuapse was the primary resupply node for Russian fleet auxiliaries servicing the remaining Black Sea Fleet grouping. Strike the depot hard enough, and the sortie tempo of Russian naval support operations collapses. The question was never whether to strike. The question was how. The obstacle that nearly killed the entire operation before it began was geography. And it was the kind of obstacle that doesn't yield to willpower. It yields only to physics and engineering. The Caucasus coastal range forms a near-continuous wall between the sea and the Russian interior south of Novorossiysk. Radar stations on those ridgelines sweep the coastal approach corridor with overlapping coverage. A standard Neptune launch from Ukrainian-controlled territory, even a modified long-range variant, would require a flight path crossing either open sea or the coastal radar picket. Either route exposed the missile to detection and potential intercept by Russian S-300 and S-400 batteries positioned along the coast. The coastal radar wall was real, the intercept threat was real, and Tuapse sat behind both of them. The HUR engineers spent weeks studying the terrain, not the straight-line approaches, the valleys. The Tuapse River Valley runs northeast from the coast, cutting through the coastal range at an elevation that sits below the dominant ridgelines to either side. A missile following the valley floor, hugging the terrain in a modified ground-hugging profile, would remain below the radar horizon of the coastal picket stations for a significant portion of its terminal approach. It wouldn't be invisible, but it would compress the intercept window to something approaching zero. The problem: the Neptune's guidance system was not programmed for terrain-following flight over complex inland topography. Its radar altimeter was calibrated for sea surface tracking, not ridge and valley navigation. Its terminal seeker was optimized for ship acquisition, a large, radar-reflective steel target on a flat reflective surface. A tank farm sits in a different electromagnetic environment entirely. The engineers rewrote the guidance package. They recalibrated the altimeter parameters for terrain-following thresholds. They reprogrammed the terminal phase to transition from low-altitude cruise to a pop-up acquisition maneuver at a waypoint calculated to bring the missile above the ridgeline, screening Tuapse's tank farm from the valley floor. High enough to acquire targets, low enough to minimize radar exposure time. They integrated new GPS-assisted waypoint navigation for the inland portion of the flight. And they validated the entire modified flight profile against simulated terrain data. Then they argued about it. Because inside the engineering team, there was genuine disagreement about whether the modified seeker could reliably discriminate between storage tank profiles and background infrastructure clutter at the acquisition range their pop-up maneuver allowed. One engineer reportedly described the terminal phase geometry as praying it locks on before the S-400 wakes up. That wasn't defeatism. That was honest engineering assessment. They flew it anyway. Which weapon system made this strike possible? Was it the Neptune's raw performance, or was it the rewritten guidance software that transformed it into something new? Comment below what you think was the decisive technical factor. The operational planning window was tight. Satellite imagery from the days before the strike had confirmed that the Tuapse depot was at high operational tempo. Marine diesel deliveries were heavy. The tank farm's primary storage cluster, 6 large cylindrical tanks in the facility's northern section, was visually assessed as full or near full. A full tank struck by a shaped charge warhead doesn't just burn, it ruptures. And when it ruptures, the blast pressure wave propagates through interconnected piping, potentially cascading damage across adjacent tanks. Ukrainian planners knew exactly what they were targeting. Not the tanks themselves, but the ripple effect of a simultaneous multi-point strike on a pressurized fuel distribution system. The Neptune battery was repositioned under electronic silence in the days before the strike. No active radar, no communications that could be intercepted. The launch vehicles. Ukrainian-built USPU 360 wheeled transporter erector launchers, moved at night, using routes pre-surveilled to avoid known Russian SIGINT collection assets. The battery's new firing position was selected for launch azimuth. The angle to Tuapse had to align the missiles with their planned valley approach entry corridor to within narrow tolerances. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 18 minutes of this engagement destroys Russia's Black Sea logistics rhythm for the weeks that follow. The launch window was narrow. Weather in the target area needed to be within parameters for the modified guidance system's terminal phase. Russian S-400 battery alert cycles had been studied through SIGINT analysis. HUR electronic intelligence collection had characterized the radar emission patterns of the coastal air defense network with enough fidelity to identify windows when surveillance radar coverage was degraded or reoriented. The Ukrainian strike planners scheduled the launch to fall within one of these windows. At the planned H hour, the USPU 360 vehicles elevated their launch rails. 4 missiles. Modified R-360 Neptune airframes with rewritten guidance packages and warheads loaded with shaped charges optimized for fuel tank penetration. The Neptune's standard warhead is a 150-kilogram semi-armor-piercing high-explosive design, powerful enough to penetrate a warship's hull before detonating internally. Against a steel cylindrical storage tank, that penetration before detonation characteristic meant the warhead would enter the tank's interior, detonating inside the fuel-air mixture space above the liquid surface. The result, when it works, is not an external explosion. It is internal detonation inside a sealed steel container filled with vaporized fuel, a pressure vessel turned into a bomb by its own contents. 4 launches. Sequential, not simultaneous. The battery fired on a programmed interval to allow each missile's booster phase to clear before the next ignition. The flames would be visible for kilometers. But the battery was already in a retrograde movement plan. The vehicles would be moving before the first missile crossed into Russian airspace. The missiles went sea-skimming initially, old habit, built into the base flight profile. Then the modified waypoint navigation system kicked in, banking the missiles north and inland, beginning the valley approach. They descended to terrain following altitude. The Caucasus ridgelines rose to either side. The missiles flew between them. Here is where the engineering argument from weeks earlier found its answer in real time. 3 of the 4 missiles completed the valley approach and executed the programmed pop-up maneuver at the designated waypoint. The terminal seekers acquired targets. The strikes hit within a window that satellite imagery would later characterize as essentially simultaneous. Impacts separated by seconds, not minutes. 3 direct hits on the northern tank cluster. The 4th missile's terminal guidance malfunctioned in the pop-up phase. Whether this was a seeker failure, a guidance software fault, or electromagnetic interference from Russian electronic warfare assets in the area, post-strike analysis could not definitively establish. The missile impacted outside the primary tank farm. It damaged infrastructure, but did not strike a primary storage tank. 3 hits. But 3 hits on full tanks, with shape-charged warheads detonating inside fuel vapor environments, produced consequences that exceeded even the optimistic end of Ukrainian planners' damage estimates. The first tank ruptured. The explosion propagated through the interconnected distribution piping to a second tank before safety isolation valves, which may or may not have been fully operational, could respond. The second tank's failure sent a pressure wave through the fuel distribution manifold system. Tank 3, connected to the same manifold, experienced what analysts would later describe as sympathetic structural failure, not from a direct missile impact, but from the cascading pressure event. 3 missiles, 6 tanks. The cascade did half the work. Ukrainian General Staff reports in the aftermath described the strike as having achieved destruction of 6 primary fuel storage tanks in the northern cluster of the Tuapse Naval Fuel Depot. Combat footage verification, cross-referenced against satellite imagery of the post-strike facility, confirmed multiple collapsed or catastrophically damaged tank structures and sustained fire across a large portion of the fuel farm's northern section. USAN investigations revealed secondary burn patterns consistent with spilled fuel ignition across the facility's internal road network. Fuel from the ruptured tanks had flowed into drainage channels and ignited, turning the facility's internal infrastructure into a burning secondary disaster zone. The entire active damage window, from first impact to the cessation of the initial explosion sequence, was under 90 seconds. 90 seconds to rupture 6 tanks. 90 seconds to eliminate an estimated 40 to 60,000 cubic meters of marine diesel fuel capacity from Russia's Black Sea logistics network. 90 seconds to collapse the throughput of the primary fuel supply node feeding Russian fleet auxiliary operations in the northeastern Black Sea. Subscribe to UkraineRadar if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because what happened in the aftermath tells you as much as the strike itself. The Russian response to the strike was revealing in what it showed about the limitations of their defensive architecture. Air defense intercepts were not reported in the time window corresponding to the strike's approach phase. The valley-following profile had worked. The coastal radar wall had been threaded. Russian air defense systems along the Tuapse coastal sector, including reported S-300 and Panzer S-1 assets, either failed to detect the approaching missiles during the valley transit or detected them too late in the terminal phase to complete a fire solution before impact. Post-strike, Russian military bloggers acknowledged the depot strike within hours. The fires were too large and too visible to suppress informationally. Early Russian claims attributed the attack to drones rather than cruise missiles. This framing was almost certainly intentional, acknowledging a Neptune strike against a target 80 kilometers inland, using a terrain-following valley approach that penetrated the coastal radar network, would have been a significant admission of the air defense failure involved. Intercepted communications, characterized by Ukrainian SIGINT collection, indicated significant disruption to fleet auxiliary operations in the period following the strike. Russian naval logistics planning for the northeastern Black Sea sector had to be comprehensively revised. Alternative fuel sourcing from Black Sea ports not affected by the strike. Novorossiysk's commercial fuel infrastructure, Temryuk, was apparently insufficient to immediately replace the Tuapse throughput. The sortie tempo of Russian fleet auxiliary vessels servicing remaining Black Sea fleet units dropped measurably in the weeks following the strike, according to Ukrainian military intelligence assessments. Fleet auxiliaries that couldn't refuel couldn't sail. Ships that couldn't be supported couldn't operate. The Black Sea fleet's already diminished operational tempo took another step down. How many primary fuel storage tanks did the Neptune missiles rupture in the Tuapse strike? Was it A3 tanks, B6 tanks, or C9 tanks? Stay with me. The answer and the engineering reason behind the number are coming at the end. If you believe tactics win wars, type UkraineRadar in the comments. Because this strike wasn't just about fuel. It was about proving that Ukrainian engineering creativity is itself a weapon, one that Russia has no direct counter for. The tactical implications of the Tuapse strike extended well beyond the immediate logistics disruption. The operation established several precedents that Ukrainian planners and their international partners took careful note of. First, the Neptune's operational envelope was no longer defined by its original design parameters. The Luch Design Bureau had demonstrated that the weapon system could be retasked for land attack operations against inland targets, using terrain-following approach profiles that circumvented coastal radar networks. This wasn't a one-time improvisation. This was a documented, validated operational concept. Future Neptune strikes against coastal region targets in Russian-controlled territory would now have an inland approach option in the planning toolkit. Second, the fuel tank cascade effect. The shaped charge warhead's penetration before detonation characteristic, combined with the interconnected piping architecture of the Tuapse Depot, had produced a damage outcome disproportionate to the number of direct hits achieved. 3 missiles had killed 6 tanks. Ukrainian strike planners updated their damage models for fuel infrastructure targets to account for cascade potential, meaning future strikes against similar facilities could achieve outsized effects with fewer weapons expended. Third, the Ukrainian engineering community's demonstrated capability to perform operational guidance software modification on a fielded missile system. In a wartime environment, under time pressure, with validation conducted through analysis rather than live fire testing, was a significant indicator of the depth of Ukraine's defense industrial technical base. This wasn't a team borrowing foreign engineering talent. These were Ukrainian engineers, working with Ukrainian design systems, pushing the performance envelope further than anyone had publicly expected. The HUR's planning and execution of the Tuapse strike reflected a mature strike campaign methodology refined through multiple Black Sea operations going back to the early full-scale phases of the war. The targeting cycle, from satellite imagery identification of high-value logistics nodes through SIGINT characterization of air defense patterns to operational planning and execution, ran efficiently. The retrograde movement of the launch battery before Russian counter-battery radar could have located the firing position was textbook. No battery was lost. No personnel were casualties in the strike unit. The operation was clean from a cost exchange perspective. Modified Neptune missiles, engineering development time, and the battery's fuel and maintenance costs against 40 to 60,000 cubic meters of Russian naval fuel and weeks of degraded fleet auxiliary operations. What would NATO have done differently in planning this strike? The terrain-following approach, the fuel cascade targeting, the timing exploitation of radar coverage gaps. Would alliance planners have arrived at the same solution? Or would bureaucratic targeting approval processes have resulted in a different weapon choice entirely? Comment your analysis. The question that Ukrainian analysts were asking internally was a harder one. What happens when Russia adapts? The Valley approach profile that made the Tuapse strike possible was not a permanent blind spot. Russian air defense planners, once they understood what had happened, could reposition radar assets to cover the Valley approach corridors. They could increase the density of low-altitude coverage systems. Panzer S-1 and Tor M2 units positioned to catch sea-skimming profiles transitioning to terrain-following flight. They could establish permanent combat air patrol orbits over the approach corridors most vulnerable to this technique. The adaptation window was finite. Ukrainian planners knew this, which meant the Tuapse operation wasn't just a strike. It was a proof of concept that needed to be exploited before the window closed. In the operational period following Tuapse, Ukrainian HUR strike planning reportedly developed additional target packages against Black Sea coastal logistics infrastructure using Neptune variants and the Valley approach profile concept. The details of those operations remain in the classified domain, but the pattern of Russian logistics disruption in the northeastern Black Sea sector in the weeks and months following Tuapse was consistent with sustained pressure on the same vulnerability the Tuapse strike had exposed. Russia's Black Sea fleet, by this phase of the war, was a shadow of the force that had threatened Odessa and the Ukrainian coast in the conflict's opening months. Neptune missiles had already sent the cruiser Moskva to the bottom of the Black Sea in one of the most consequential single naval engagements of the conflict's history. Neptune coastal batteries had forced Russian surface combatants out of the northwestern Black Sea entirely. Drone boats. Ukrainian-developed surface drones, cheap and operationally effective, had struck Russian warships at anchor in Sevastopol, forcing the fleet to disperse further. And now Neptune, retasked and reimagined, was reaching inland to strangle the logistical infrastructure that kept the remaining fleet operational. The Black Sea had become Ukraine's domain, not because Ukraine had a navy. Ukraine's surface navy had been deliberately scuttled early in the conflict to prevent capture. Ukraine had turned the Black Sea into its operational territory through missile innovation, engineering adaptation, and a targeting philosophy that identified and systematically attacked the enemy's center of gravity at every level, from warships to headquarters to fuel depots. This is the doctrine that UkraineRadar exists to analyze. Not just the individual engagements, but the strategic logic that strings them together into a coherent campaign. Real tactics, real consequences. UkraineRadar. The deeper lesson of Tuapse was about the nature of weapon system development under conditions of existential warfare. The Luch Design Bureau didn't design the Neptune for land attack because they had the luxury of a clean planning horizon. They redesigned it for land attack because the war demanded it, and because Ukrainian engineers are At their core, problem solvers operating under the kind of pressure that either breaks an organization or reveals its genuine depth of talent. What Tuapse revealed was depth. There is something worth sitting with in the image of those engineers arguing about whether the seeker could lock on in time. They were not arguing about whether to try. They were arguing about the technical details of how to make it work. The decision to push the weapon system beyond its design parameters was already made. The only question was engineering. That posture, not should we try, but how do we make this work, is the defining characteristic of Ukrainian defense innovation throughout this conflict. Russian military doctrine, by contrast, has shown repeated failures of adaptive engineering. The weapons Russia deploys are largely Soviet-designed systems updated incrementally. When those systems encounter novel operational conditions, the institutional response has consistently been to push more of the same rather than reimagine the tool. More Shahed drones, more Kaliber missiles, more Lancet loitering munitions. These are competent weapons, but they are not reinvented weapons. Russia buys them from Iran. It integrates components from Chinese suppliers. It fires North Korean artillery ammunition because its own production cannot keep pace with expenditure rates. It does not, in this war, produce teams of engineers staying late in Luch's design halls to reprogram guidance systems for missions nobody anticipated. That asymmetry, Ukrainian engineering creativity versus Russian procurement dependency, is one of the underappreciated fault lines of this conflict. And it shows up most clearly in moments like Tuapse, where a coastal anti-ship missile threads a mountain valley to strike a fuel depot 80 kilometers inland. The operational aftermath of Tuapse played out across the logistics architecture of the Russian Black Sea sector in ways that satellite imagery and OSINT tracking made visible over the following weeks. Commercial fuel vessels that had been servicing the Tuapse depot adjusted their routing. Russian logistics planners attempted to reroute marine fuel deliveries through Novorossiysk's commercial port infrastructure, increasing pressure on a system already operating near capacity. Russian Black Sea auxiliary vessel activity, tracked through AIS data monitoring and satellite imagery of anchorages, declined measurably in the post-strike period. Fleet auxiliaries anchored rather than sailed. Ships that couldn't be fueled didn't move. And a fleet that doesn't move cannot project power, cannot support mining operations, cannot conduct humanitarian obstruction operations in the grain corridor. The Tuapse strike's effects were not spectacular in the way that a warship sinking is spectacular. They were quiet, logistical, methodical. The Russian Black Sea Fleet didn't sink, it starved, which, in its own way, is a more complete victory than sinking it. Was Ukraine right to invest engineering resources in retasking the Neptune for land attack? Or should those resources have been directed toward new platform development? Think about that question. We read every comment, and this one has a real answer that depends on your theory of how innovation works in wartime. The HUR's patience in building the intelligence picture for Tuapse is worth noting separately. The targeting cycle for an operation this complex, identifying the depot as the decisive node, characterizing the approach corridors, analyzing air defense coverage gaps, timing the launch against radar emission cycle patterns, took months of sustained collection and analysis. Ukrainian intelligence, working in coordination with allied satellite imagery providers and SIGINT resources, built the targeting package for Tuapse over an extended period. This is the part of modern warfare that documentaries rarely capture. The months of quiet work that precede 90 seconds of fire. The pattern analysis. The revisit cycles of satellite coverage. The SIGINT characterization of radar emission patterns. The engineering development and validation of the modified guidance package. The positioning of the launch battery. The weather monitoring. The coordination of the launch window with air defense cycle analysis. All of it invisible. All of it essential. All of it predating the strike by weeks or months. And behind that analytical and engineering effort, human beings. HUR analysts working extended hours to build a targeting picture precise enough to thread a missile through a mountain valley. Engineers at Luch staying late to rewrite guidance code. Launch crews moving vehicles at night in radio silence, under the constant awareness that Russian SIGINT collection was attempting to locate them. Every element of the Tuapse operation was performed by people who understood that failure had consequences beyond the mission. Consequences measured in continued Russian fleet logistics throughput, in continued fuel delivery to vessels that were using that fuel to support military operations against Ukrainian cities and Ukrainian people. The courage required to run this kind of operation. Not battlefield courage, though the launch crew's position was not without risk, but the sustained, methodical courage of building a complex operation over months and executing it with precision is the kind that rarely gets the recognition it deserves. UkraineRadar documents it because it defines how this war has been fought. Subscribe to UkraineRadar, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Will Ukraine continue to develop the Neptune's land attack variant into a systematic deep strike capability? Or was Tuapse the peak of this particular operational innovation? Comment why yes if you think we'll see more Valley approach Neptune strikes. No if you think Russia adapts fast enough to close that window permanently. The Tuapse Naval Fuel Depot is quieter now. What remains of the northern tank cluster is twisted steel and hardened residue. The concrete tank foundation stained with the burn signatures of catastrophic fuel release. Russian logistics planners have had to work around the gap in capacity. The valley that carried those missiles inland has no memory of them. The ridgelines on either side saw nothing unusual on their radar screens, and that invisibility is the entire point. The lesson of Tuapse, stated simply, in modern warfare, a weapon is not defined by its original mission profile. It is defined by what engineers can make it do when the war demands something its designers never anticipated. Ukraine has proven, repeatedly and across different weapon domains, that it understands this. Russian forces, with their doctrinal rigidity and procurement dependency, have struggled to match it. Now for the answer to our quiz from earlier in the video. The question was, how many primary fuel storage tanks did the Neptune missiles rupture in the Tuapse strike? The answer is B6 tanks. 3 missiles scored direct hits on the northern tank cluster, but the cascade effect. Internal detonation inside fuel vapor environments propagating through interconnected distribution piping caused 3 additional tanks to experience catastrophic structural failure beyond the 3 direct hits. The engineering principle here is the pressure vessel cascade. A shaped charge warhead that penetrates a tank's steel wall before detonating creates a pressure event inside a sealed fuel vapor environment. That internal detonation propagates through any connected piping or manifold system faster than safety isolation valves can respond. 3 hits became 6 casualties because the fuel distribution system's interconnection turned each direct hit into a node of pressure propagation. Ukrainian strike planners had modeled this cascade potential. The outcome validated the model. 3 questions to take with you from this analysis. Was the decision to retask the Neptune for land attack, investing months of engineering resources in guidance software modification and validation, the right strategic choice, given that those resources could have been directed toward accelerating production of proven systems? Could Russia have prevented the Tuapse strike by deploying additional low-altitude radar coverage in the Valley approach corridors? And why didn't they do so despite Neptune's known coastal threat profile? And finally, what would you have done differently if you were the HUR strike planner responsible for Tuapse? The missile choice, the approach geometry, the timing, the target selection within the depot? Real battles, real tactics, real consequences. UkraineRadar. The Tuapse Valley is quiet now. The ridgelines see only weather. But somewhere in the northeastern Black Sea, the auxiliary vessels that were supposed to be fueled from those tanks are anchored and waiting. And somewhere in a Ukrainian engineering office, the next modification to the next weapon system is already being planned. Silent preparation, invisible adaptation. Modern warfare punishes tactical rigidity without mercy and rewards creative engineering with the only currency that matters in a war of this kind: results. Stay vigilant.